It's the Resistance Report, February 23rd, 2017. Good evening. Tonight, I should warn you, we are not in my office. We are in the Morrison Library here at the University of California at Berkeley under the auspices of the Townsend Center for the Humanities and the Writing Program. But before I turn to questions from many of the students here, I just want to get a few things off my chest as usual. For one thing, there was a report today in the New York Times that despite the fact that Donald Trump promised during the campaign to protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, several of his assistants are getting ready to submit a budget that begins the process of undermining Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid as a way of avoiding huge budget deficits and huge debts in the future, because obviously what they want to do is provide a huge tax cut to the wealthy and to corporations and a big military buildup. And the only way you can accomplish all of that is to cut the big ones, the big programs that are domestic programs. Those are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Paul Ryan has been pushing this for a long time. When he was the chair of the Budget Committee in the House, Paul Ryan was trying to get a Medicaid program that would be essentially a block grant to the states. He was also trying to peddle a Medicare program that would be a voucher program. It would not keep up with inflation. It would actually reduce Medicare over time. It never got anywhere, but it never got anywhere in part because Barack Obama was president. Now it could get somewhere, particularly when you understand that Mick Mulvaney, who was a member of the House, is now the budget director for Donald Trump, called Social Security a Ponzi scheme not too many years ago, a Ponzi scheme. And also, considering that Tom Price, who is now Health and Human Services Secretary for Donald Trump, who was in the House, also agreed with major cuts in Medicare, and Medicaid was one of Paul Ryan's biggest supporters in the House. So you can see how all the puzzle pieces fit together. And by the way, Social Security is not a Ponzi scheme. In a former life, I was a trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. I know exactly what's going on with those two trust funds. Social Security is not a problem. It could easily be fixed. It could easily provide enough for everybody who is eligible for it for the next 60 to 80 years. Many of the young people here are surrounding me here tonight. They will get their Social Security, believe it or not, but it can be fixed very easily. One easy fix is just raising the cap on income subject to Social Security. Right now, this year, it's about $127,000. Any earnings above $127,000 are not taxed with regard to Social Security taxes. Well, that's a pretty regressive system in certain ways. If you're very rich, if you're Bill Gates, you satisfy your Social Security payroll taxes for the year at approximately 1 minute past midnight on January 1st. There are other ways of doing it. By raising the cap on income subject to Social Security, you can make Social Security perfectly fine for years to come. And it's not a Ponzi scheme because people have paid into Social Security. It's not as if they somehow have something coming to them that they have not actually paid into. And with regard to Medicare, Medicare is in trouble, but it's in trouble because health care expenses in general have been going up, because the baby boomers are getting older and they are needing more medical assistance and their bodies are all corroding together. And so that is not an unexpected problem. Medicare is actually more efficient as a program than private health insurance, and certainly it's more efficient as a program than almost any other policies we have for providing health care to the elderly. We ought to have Medicare for all. Its administrative costs are far below the costs of private, for-profit health insurance. And so what the Republicans are doing, in essence, and I want to make sure you understand this because it needs to be seen for what it is a way of cutting programs that the working class, the middle class, and poor depend on, including Medicaid, and instead providing big tax cuts to corporations and to the wealthy. That, in my book, is not the direction this country needs to go in. The other thing I want to get off my chest tonight has to do with the Democratic National Committee. They are having a vote this weekend on who will be the new chair of the DNC. A lot of excitement and a lot of concern and a lot of passion going into a fight over the leadership. I don't think that is really the biggest deal in front of us. The movement that has been gaining steam since Donald Trump was elected president is not a movement about the Democratic Party, per se. It's a movement about inclusion versus exclusion. It's a movement about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's a movement that promotes the kind of public investments in people, in education, in job training, in health care that we so desperately need in this country. This doesn't have to be a Democratic movement. And by the way, it's a movement against authoritarianism in all its forms. That means Donald Trump. But to the extent that it's only seen as a democratic movement, capital D, it's seen as a partisan movement. It can so easily be discounted by Donald Trump and his enablers and others as just typical partisan politics, which is why it is so important that the movement, our movement, be bipartisan, be understood to be encompassing Republicans who are equally concerned about what is happening in the Trump administration. In fact, I was interested in this regard that the Conservative Political Action Convention, the CPAC, that started just 2 days ago, yesterday at its official beginning, the executive director of CPAC assailed the alt-right movement, saying that the alt-right movement had nothing to do with conservatism, that the alt-right movement really was a form of fascism. Now, what he was talking about was obviously Steve Bannon and Breitbart News and all of the people associated with Bannon and Breitbart News who have twisted an agenda, a conservative agenda, into an authoritarian agenda that has all the trappings, according to the CPAC executive director, of fascism. Again, what we need is a bipartisan movement against this kind of authoritarianism. And I think with time, we will have it. I want to thank all of you for going to your members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, telling them that you do not want the Affordable Care Act to be repealed, or if it's going to be replaced with something equally good, telling them you don't want the kind of tax cuts on the wealthy that are going to leave everybody else stranded, telling them exactly what you think about Donald Trump's attacks on the free press and also on the judiciary and on immigrants and on others in this society who are too weak to stand up for themselves. You have been holding members of Congress accountable, and if you do that, they will in turn hold Donald Trump accountable. So thank you for that. You're having a big, big impact out there in congressional districts, even if the press doesn't know about all of it. Now I am going to turn to questions, and we're going to have questions, hopefully, from many of the people who are sitting around me today. I hope you have questions. Anybody? Yes. And I will repeat your question.
So when it comes to the problems that we face due to regressive taxation policies like Social Security that you mentioned, what is the moral personal responsibility of not necessarily the people making those policies, but the independently wealthy individuals that are benefiting from them?
So you're asking, what is the moral responsibility of independently wealthy individuals with regard to regressive tax policies like Social Security? And I suppose one way of answering that would be, well, if you are a morally responsible person and you're very wealthy, you should reject even taking Social Security. That's one possibility. But I think a more effective possibility is that people, whether they are wealthy or middle class or poor, they come together and decide that they want to make sure that Social Security is a progressive, not a regressive system. I didn't even mention one very important regressive aspect of Social Security today, and that is that with widening inequality, if you're poor, chances are you're going to live far fewer years than if you're rich. The gap in lifespan between the poor and the rich gets wider and wider and wider, which means that the rich are collecting more and more Social Security because they live longer relative to the poor. So what you need to do, wealthy individual, if you have particularly more political clout than people who are not wealthy, you need to stand up for a system that is more progressive and fair. Yes.
Yes. So I understand that political divisions, political opinions always differ, but it just nowadays it seems so much more difficult to reach across the aisle and get the opinions. And specifically, in Berkeley, it is a very liberal place. What would you say to and I'm one too, like a self-identified liberal, to try to understand the other side of the argument?
The question you were asking, and I'm repeating it so our guests on Facebook Live can hear the question as well, is how do you go about even finding people who disagree with you? If you're at Berkeley, for example, how do you even go about finding conservatives and have a civil discussion with conservatives? Is that sort of what you asked?
I mean, like, people who disagree always exist, and it's easily, you can find them. But how do you maintain a civil and substantive discourse? Okay.
How do you maintain a civil and substantive discourse with people who disagree with you? And it's harder and harder and harder now. We're not talking only about liberals at Berkeley. We're talking about everybody, even members of the same family. Some people here, you may have members of your family who you have a hard time talking with, not because you are 20 years old, and they are not, but because the political divisions are wider now than they've been in a number of years. Let me just relate to you a quick story, because working on a new documentary that Yael and I are now working on with some others, we went to visit a fellow named David Bratt, who is a congressman from the 7th District of Virginia. Now, David Bratt is labeled by the Conservative Digest as one of the two most conservative members of Congress. He is obviously a Republican. And I called him up and asked that we get together and talk, because I was interested in one facet of his philosophy. And I became aware of this when David Bratt ran successfully against Eric Cantor, who was then majority leader of the House. No majority leader in a primary, in a Republican or any Democratic primary, had ever been displaced by a primary opponent. And yet, miraculously, David Bratt had won. And he had won by calling Eric Cantor a crony capitalist, by saying that Eric Cantor was in the pockets of Wall Street, that Eric Cantor was taking big money and therefore was violating the interests of average working people. I was interested in that because, again, this is not your typical crosscut. And what I assume, and I keep on finding more and more the case, that it is not Democrats versus Republicans. It's not classic small government conservatives versus classic big government liberals. Today, it is more and more about anti-establishment versus establishment. People who are viewing our political and economic system as fundamentally corrupt, as rigged in favor of the crony capitalists, as David Bratt actually, it turned out, viewed the problem. And when we got together and had several hours to talk, it turned out that on this set of issues, which is so critical, we had much more in agreement than we had in disagreement. And so the moral of the story is, rather than assume just because somebody calls him or herself a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a liberal, rather than assume that there's a vast gulf between you, I think it more useful these days to to seek out people who share your particular views about whether our system, our political economic system, is working for the majority or not working for the majority, and if it's not, why not? That's a very constructive discussion to have. And you may be surprised at how many people on the other side, the other party, the other label, agree with you. Questions? Any more questions over here? Yes?
So you mentioned when you just spoke, congressmen and senators and other representatives holding Donald Trump accountable. And recently, in the midst of all of the voting for confirmations for various posts that he's appointing, there has been action by people in those positions in terms of boycotting or delaying those votes. But I'm curious whether or not you think that that is enough of a way to hold the other side accountable, or a way to sort of take a stand against the kind of appointments he's making, or whether you think there's more better action that should be taken.
Well, the question is, what kind of action can people take to resist Donald Trump and what he represents and the effect he's having in the country, and what's the most effective way of doing that? I really think there are two general categories of action. Number one, demonstrations and basic statements by groups of people who are saying, in effect, marching, making a very, very powerful statement that they disagree. But that's not nearly enough. It's too easy to demonstrate. It's too easy to march. What is much harder and more important is to get involved in the actual strategy and operations of politics. And that means organizing people. It means mobilizing people. It means energizing people, getting involved right now in the midterm elections that are coming up. It may seem a long time, but it's not a long time, because coming up very soon are attempts by both parties to select candidates who may be in opposition to the sitting candidates in the House in primaries. Many people could get into primary contests if they wished. You can also get into state governments. State governments we haven't talked about, but they are very, very important places where many important policies are made. And here again, political strategy, organizing, mobilizing, and energizing are critically important. There is a group called indivisibleguide.com that I've been touting in my resistance reports, because they are very experienced and wise. They're former congressional staffers. They know how to motivate members of Congress. And they are the ones who actually are providing people around the country with a great deal of information about where their members of Congress are going to be holding town hall meetings. This is another very important part of the strategy. Rather than just demonstrating on the streets, actually going to a town hall where a member of Congress is coming to talk to constituents and being a constituent and having questions and holding that member of Congress accountable and not letting go when a question just avoids answering, answer a follow-up question. And if the member of Congress never shows, and many of them are no-shows, then actually having a chair with a cardboard cutout of that member of Congress and inviting the media to come and actually see the town meeting that wasn't. In other words, there are many, many things that you can do. My general point is that being a citizen activist is much more than just voting and paying taxes and serving on juries. It really is viewing politics as a practice that is a practice that one takes on, if not daily, then at least weekly, like any other practice, learning to play the violin, any other practice, but it is a critically important practice. These days, a lot of people are learning, if they didn't learn it before, that they have to be a citizen activist. Yes?
How are we supposed to organize politically when we have just this bottomless pile of homework here at Berkeley? I mean, they keep us so busy. And that homework and the job search that everybody is so invested in as well also takes up a decent amount of the dialogue. How do we convince everybody to reprioritize a little bit?
Well, you don't have to convince anybody to reprioritize. You reprioritize yourself. Now, I'm sure that you have a lot of work to do and a lot of homework, and I apologize to the extent that I've been contributing to that. But that is our responsibility as professors, and it's your responsibility. You're paying a lot, or somebody's paying a lot for you to be here. We want you to learn. But it doesn't mean that you have no free time at all. In fact, I would venture to say, if I were speculating, just sheerly guessing, that you do have a little bit of free time. Most Americans actually do have free time. They have a lot of work to do, and they have child care, and they have everything else, but they do watch television, or they watch series, or they spend a lot of time on the computer. Everybody can make time for politics if they want to make time for it. Yes?
As we've seen from our current election, it's obvious that a lot of people have very varying perspectives based on values and where they come from. But I feel like the biggest problem that we have is communication. How can liberals and conservatives be able to communicate to create a solution without either side getting defensive?
The question is, how can, and you're using the labels liberals and conservatives
As one form of identity.
as one form of identity, communicate without, because the language and the labels and the ways of and the modes of discussion can be very provocative and can, in that sense, cut off discussion, you're saying.
Yeah.
And in my experience, one very important thing to do, particularly with friends or family members or people you know who you don't share their same political perspective, is to use, at least at the beginning, use humor. Humor is the vast underrated solvent. One of my closest friends in the world is a former Republican senator named Alan Simpson. And we agree on almost nothing, but we laugh a lot. And after we laugh, we actually have some great discussions. So that's one technique. Another technique is to just avoid unnecessarily provocative language. I mean, the verb exploitation is one that always rubs me the wrong way. A lot of people on the left always talk about somebody exploiting somebody else. Well, maybe they are exploiting, but that doesn't actually convey very much information. And it very often gets people, for example, a CEO who is accused of exploiting his workers, gets them unnecessarily defensive. You can zoom in on very particular behavior or very particular issues that you may disagree about. And the more particularized, the better. If you disagree with somebody about the minimum wage, you happen to think that the minimum wage sets a humane, decent minimum standard with regard to pay, and somebody else says, no, if you raise the minimum wage, it's going to lead to fewer jobs. Well, on that basis, it is possible, believe it or not, to have a reasonable, logical discussion, even based on evidence. Which gets me to my last point, and that is that there are facts out there. There is evidence, there is logic, there is analysis. There are a lot of people, even though you don't see it so much on television, there are a lot of people who disagree with you, but who might be persuaded by facts. And one of the most dangerous things to me to come out of the Trump administration in the first 5 weeks is a rejection of the standard sources of facts, whether they be mainstream media or science, gag orders on certain departments, kind of an attempt to change the calculation of the way certain government data is calculated, so people get confused about the facts, combined with very big lies emanating from the President of the United States. And those big lies also, if they're repeated over and over again, get people just disoriented and confused, even if they suspect that those lies are based not on facts, but on wishful thinking. So, again, that's my advice. We have time for maybe one more question. Yeah.
So yesterday, I think we all know by now, the Trump administration declared regulations for
Well, I think your question is about the administration's decision to take away essentially the rights of transgendered students to go to restrooms that are in accord with their feelings about who they are and what their bodies are. And that seems to me not only cruel, because you're dealing with kids who are going through all sorts of torment to begin with, but it's also unnecessary. I mean, when you're dealing with cruelty that's unnecessary, I'm sorry, I don't think that there's any place for that. There's also a lot of cruelty going on with regard to the travel ban directed at Muslims. There's also a lot of cruelty going on with regard to the immigration orders right now that are putting a lot of people whose status may be technically undocumented, but they've been here for many years and they've worked as members of their community and they are productive. It just unleashes fear in a very inhumane way. So I am outraged about all of this. But your question wasn't about outrage. Your question was how to channel the outrage into something that's productive. And I'm not sure I have anything more to add than I've already talked about. That is, there is no substitute for getting together with others and organizing and mobilizing, being active politically, talking to people who may have different labels over their heads in terms of Republican or conservative, but who may agree with you on this issue or on other issues. The more you can reach across the aisle and find people who actually agree on particular issues, the stronger your voice becomes. Because then it is not easy to just label it as, oh, it's just another liberal identity issue. It really has much more potency as a fundamental matter of human rights and social rights. So on that note, I'm going to officially end this resistance report tonight, and thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for participating, and we'll see you tomorrow.